Information hiding is implemented with the help of interfaces. Only the relevant information is given to them in the form of an interface, and all other irrelevant information are hidden from the user. There are two kinds of code documentation, namely internal documentation and external documentation. External documentation makes the user aware of the error that occur while returning the software code. Hello and warm welcome to One and All. It is Dr. Ravi Kumar, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, MYSURU, the Temple of Excellence. In today's session, you will be taught about the information hiding. That means the relevant information which is required for user is given to him, and all other unnecessary details or which is not relevant for a user is not given to him. That is called as hiding the information. That is also called as an abstraction. Also called as an abstraction. A software developer applies information hiding in software design and coding to hide unnecessary details from the rest of the program, that is from the user. Because we do not want to give a complete details of the program description to the user or to a client, because it is not at all necessary for him. He does not want to think over the complicated information which is defined in the programs. He just want to have the use of that program. That is why we give only the relevant information to him. That means the objective of information hiding is to minimize the complexities among different modules of the software. We should notice that the complexities arise when one program or module in software is dependent on several other programs and modules. When one module is dependent on another module or several other modules, then the complexity arises. That means whether the cohesion as well as the coupling comes into the picture. Information hiding. Information hiding is implemented with the help of interfaces. You will also study the same concept in Java. An interface is a medium of interaction for software components that are using the properties of the software modules obtaining data. That means containing data. The implementation of interfaces depends on the syntax and process. Examples of interface include constants, data types, types of procedure, and so on. Interfaces protect other parts of programs when a software design is changed. That means when the design part of that is changed, obviously the implementation also changes. Generally, the interfaces acts as a foundation to modular programming, that is top-down programming, as well as the object-oriented programming. In case of object-oriented programming, interface, that means in case of Java, interface of an object comprises of set of methods which are used to interact with the objects of the software programs. The word interface indicates that it is a gateway to interact with other objects. That means using information hiding, a single program is divided into several modules. These modules are independent of each other and each can be used interchangeably in other software programs as well. This also used to understand the concept of information hiding. Let us consider the example of a program written for a car. The program can be organized in several ways. Let me take one of the important example here in the form of C++, which is a purely object-oriented programming language. Suppose we have a class called car. We have a class called car here. What is the chassis number of that car? It has to be in the form of double. The chassis number of a car is not required for user while driving. let it be in the user manuals. So, how many gears are there that is required for him? Gears. Int gears. What is the model of that car? That is also required. Model is represented in the form of year, whether the model is 2021 or 2020, 2019, 2018, so on, anything like that. Model can also be represented as year, int. So we have three properties here. Let me write down one function for this. Display details. Now, let me consider this as a void display details because it returns nothing. It performs only the task of presenting it to the user, displaying it to the user. So, Cout, what is the value it is supposed to display? Chassis number. The chassis number of a car is let me write down this. End of line. We have this. Then similarly, we will write down one more Cout statement to display the number of gears and the number of what is the model of that car. Cout. Then we will end the function. As soon as we end the function, we will also write down the object. That is, we define an object for this car. That means car C is equal to new car function. By default, it invokes the constructor car, where C is an instance of an object which is created for this car class. Now, as soon as the object is created, the data members like properties like chassis number, gears and model will get activated. That means memory is allocated to those variables as well as to the variables associated with the function definition will come to life. That means this is just a template now, blueprint. We do not have the memory allocated to it. So we have a car object here. So C.displayDetails will invoke the functionality of, that is, the details of a car is displayed. That is, the chassis number of a car is, so on. The number of gears supported in that car, so on, 6 gears, so on like that. What is the model of that? The model of a car is this. That is, in case in the form of user manual, we can display that. Similarly, if I want to hide the information, I'll go for interfaces. How interfaces are implemented in object-oriented programming like C++? We have inheritance concept. The concept of inheritance is used to interface one of the object with another object. That means information hiding, only the relevant information is given to them in the form of an interface and all other irrelevant information are hidden from the user. That is the thing we are doing here. The same thing is explained here. One is to arrange the modules into using information hiding. In this case, the modules can be created as the front part, middle part and the rear part. These are the attributes considering here. On the other hand, the creating modules using the information hiding includes the specifying the names of modules such as engine and steering. That is engine number and steering, and all those details are defined in the definition. The same thing is defined for this. That is, within a class, we will have the properties like front part, middle part and rear part. In the function definition, we will have, and also we will have the engine number and steering number. We will be having this. In the modules, we will be having the function definitions where these function definitions are invoked through the objects. On comparison, it is found that modules created without using information hiding affect other modules. Suppose if I do not use the information hiding, that would affect the other modules because there is no hidden information between one module to another module. Everything is transparent among those. So it becomes a problem. That is, cohesion and coupling is more in that. This is because when a module is modified, if it affects the data, which does not require modification. However, if modules are created using information hiding, then modules are concerned only with specific segments of the program and not the whole program or other parts of the program. That means only the relevant information is needed. In our examples, we have this statement means that the module engine does not have any effect on the module steering. We have two modules here. One of the module is engine and the other module is steering. We have two functions here. And all these modules comes into the picture. Then which are the modules that are not relevant for the user? Steering. The module, this one, engine, which may be required for him. Then the module which is not relevant for him shall be hidden from the user. That is the main thing you need to notice here. Then coding and documentation is a manual cum guide that helps in understanding and correctly utilizing the software code. The coding standards and naming conventions used or written in the commonly spoken language in code documentation provide enhanced clarity for the designer. For example, moreover, they act as a guide for the software maintenance team. This team focuses on maintaining the software by improving and enhancing the software after it has been delivered to the end user. While the software maintenance process is carried out in this way, code documentation facilitates code reusability. Please notice that the code documentation will help them to reuse the code which is already available. That is, reuse option is also provided in the object-oriented approach. And of course, we will also find the same kind of reuse approach in structured programming approach. But it is a purely object-oriented programming that helps us to hide the details which are not relevant for the user. So object-oriented programming is more essential in hiding the details from the user. That's why we objects orients towards class. That means vice versa. Class orients towards object. That means as soon as the objects are created, the memory to the class properties are become active. That means the properties of a class will become active. While writing a software code, the developer needs proper documentation for reference purposes. That means the design time documentation, SRS collecting documentation. All these are essential at the time of coding because he does not know what is the requirement of a client. Once when he goes through the documentation, he understands what is actually exactly required for a client, and based upon his requirement, he starts thinking and starts develop a product for him. So programming is an ongoing process and requires modification from time to time. When number of software developers are writing the code for the same software, complexity increases. Let me tell you this. With the help of documentation, software developers can reduce the complexity by referencing the code documentation. Suppose if they do not have the documentation which was done at the time of software requirement specification as well as during the time of design analysis, then the complexity increases. That means as to how, with just visual words, with the words which they have heard about the module to be developed, it is very difficult for them. So if it is documented, if it is there in the form of a description, then it is very easy for them to implement the code which is actually required for the client. Some of the documenting techniques are comments, visual appearances of codes. Please note that we have comments, visual appearances of codes, and programming tools are very, very important. Comments are used to make the reader understand the logic of a particular code segment, because one of the software developer develops a code And if it does not write the functionality of that in the form of a comments, the other person who wants to go through the code may not understand what is the logic of that. So comments are very, very essential and important. So the visual appearance of a code is the way in which the program should be formatted to increase the readability. That means readability is also another important criteria that helps us to use the visual appearance of a code much better. The programming tools in code documentation are algorithms, flowcharts, and pseudocodes. First, they will design a flowchart. Then they will write down the algorithms. These algorithms are transformed into the form of coding. So all these are very much essential for the type of development. Code documentation involves source code, which is useful for the software developers in writing the software code. The code documents can be created with the help of various coding tools that are used to auto-generate the code documents. For example, if you look at the GUI, that means graphical user interfaces of many of the applications, software applications. If you drag and just drop those components onto the GUI window, that automatically generates the code in the backend. So all those things must be documented in the documentation. So you might have observed that at the time of delivery of software product to the client, they will be having a bundle of books maintaining the description of that software. So in other words, these documents extract comments from the source code and create a reference manual in the form of text or HTML file. That means they can also create a website for the client stating that this is the requirement of a client which you had requested, and this is the code we have developed according to your requirement. That shall be presented to him in the form of a document, that is in the form of a web pages, HTML and text documents. The auto-generated code helps the software developers to extract the source code from the comments. That is, comments are just a part of the code segment, but it is not actually compiled by the compiler. However, we consider these comments as a part of the source code to indicate that that is essentially needed to make others understand what is the functionality of the code segment. Then, this documentation also contains the application programming interfaces and the data structures used and algorithms. There are two kinds of code documentation, namely internal documentation and external documentation. I have already discussed about the internal documentation in the previous sessions. Let me explain it once again. The documentation which focuses on the information that is used to determine the software code is known as the internal documentation. The information that is used to determine the software code is known as the internal documentation. That means the description of the code which is written in the form of a comments to indicate that this is the logic of that functionality of a code segment. That indicates that is the internal documentation that is maintained in every company's software companies. It describes the data structures, algorithms and control flow in the programs as well. And also I stated that the external documentation, the documentation or user manuals that is given to him is called as an external documentation. Then there are various guidelines for making the documentation easily understandable to the reader, that is to the user. Some of the general conventions to be used at the time of internal documentation are header comment, as I told you, blocks, program comments and formatting. All these comes into the picture. Header comments blocks are useful in identifying the purpose of the code along with details such as how the code functions and how each segment of code is used in the program. That means we have this. For identifying, at the beginning of that, we will write down the comments. What is the functionality of that particular logic? That is described in the form of a description, in the form of a comments. Then, since the software code is updated and revised several times, that is new version of the software is released into the market, it is important to keep a record of the code information so that internal documentation reflects the changes made in the earlier one, that is in the software code. What was the documentation that they had done earlier and what is the documentation that they have now, and how it is going to be released in the into the market, and how it is going to be helpful for the users. Internal documentation should explain how each code segment relates to the user requirements in the software. Generally, internal documentation consists of the following information. The first one is name, type and purpose of each variable and the data structure used in the code. I told you that the type of data structure used in the code. Then brief description of algorithms, logic and error handling techniques. Information about the required input and expected output of the program. Assistance on how to test the software. Then we have information on the upgradations and enhancements in the program. All these are some of the important functionalities which are noticed in the internal documentations. Then documentation which focuses on general description of the software code and is not concerned with its detail are known as external documentation, also called as an user manual. It does not describe anything about the functionality of the code segment. What is the logic written over there is not at all described in the external documentation because it has to be simple and readable to the user and understandable. It includes information such as function of code, name of the software developer who has written the code and the algorithms used in the software code, dependency of code on programs, libraries and other things. That means it is not at all necessary for the user what is the programming language used and how does the functionality of that may be utilized in that particular scenario. All those things are not at all required for a user. A user just wants to use the software code or a software product, that's all. The only as to how he can use the software, that is required for him. That is information hiding. That means giving only the relevant information to the user and hiding all other irrelevant information in the form of documentation as well is a concept which I am explaining now. Generally, external documentation includes structure charts for providing the outline of the program and describing the design of the program. Then, external documentation is useful for software developers as it consists of information such as description of the program along with the program written to solve it. That means he will be given with a problem statement. The problem statement is given to him, but that is only required for him to define the task. What has to be the functionality of the code segment, that is required for him. So, in addition, it describes the approach used in solving the problem. Yes, see here. That is the operational requirements of a program and user interface components. All those are required for him. For the purpose of readability and proper understanding, the detailed description is accompanied by figures and illustrations that show how one component is related to another. All these are called as this external documentation. This external documentation explains why a particular solution is chosen and implemented in the software. We have various solutions. That means the logic of one program varies from another logic. That means the programmer who writes the code and who approaches the problem may be different from another person. So the logic also who has used the logic in that particular program may also be different from the one which is used by another person. So if that is the case, it also includes formulas. That means what is the formula he has used, conditions and references from where the algorithms or documentations are derived. If you look at the research papers, you will observe that equations, formulas, how those equations and formulas are transformed into the form of coding, that is the form of internal documentation, which is done by the developer. Only thing is the document problem statement is given to him. He has to go through the equations and that has to be transformed into an appropriate form of coding, that is to the logic. External documentation makes the user aware of the error that occur while returning the software code. For example, if an array of 5 numbers is used, it should be mentioned in the external documentation that the limit of the array is 5, because the user must have the knowledge of that. So the minimum requirement that is required for him is given to him, and rest of the information is hidden from him. So with this, I'm concluding this session. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all, my dear students.